Postcards from Beyond, written and narrated by Paul Harris. Retrospection. Engineers at an aeronautics company designed a window for aeroplane cockpits made from a substance they believed would be able to withstand the impact of a bird hitting it whilst airborne. Confident of their design, they organised a media event where they would unveil it with a demonstration. To replicate the impact of an aeroplane and a bird colliding in mid-flight, the engineers decided to fire a dead chicken straight at the aeroplane's cockpit window using a high-velocity cannon. Unfortunately, when they shot the chicken at the window, the dead bird not only went straight through the window, it carried on right down the entire length of the fuselage and came out again through the tail. The engineers were quite taken aback by this unexpected outcome to their demonstration and were at a loss to explain why it had not worked. They went back to the drawing board and carefully rechecked every element in the design of the window. After 6 months, they felt they were ready for another public demonstration. This time the experiment went exactly to plan. The chicken hit the window, but this time bounced off without cracking it. Impressed by this turnaround in fortunes, a journalist asked one of the engineers what they had changed from their original design. "Oh, nothing," replied the engineer. "It's just that this time we remembered to defrost the chicken." The Buddha maintained that mindfulness is the one way to the cessation of suffering. This is so true. We can never come to the full realization of enlightenment unless we develop awareness of what is taking place in our experience moment by moment. Mindfulness alone, however, is not enough. Such presence of mind needs to be supported by another mental quality, that of wise reflection. The Buddha's son, Rahula, joined the monastic order when still a little boy. One day he was found to have lied. His father gently admonished him. Using the idea of a reflection of a mirror, he encouraged his son to contemplate his behaviour in body, speech and mind, and whether it harmed him or others or both. If it did, then such an action was not to be performed. If it did not, then it was fine to act in that way. The Buddha encouraged Rahula to develop this reflective attitude before he acted, whilst he performed an action, and subsequent to when he performed an action. Clearly, the Buddha was maintaining that everyone, even a little boy, is responsible for their actions and the results that come from them. Wise reflection is the ability to process retrospectively the information that comes from mindfully investigating our experience. This look back at events is an integral part of developing clear comprehension and wisdom. Yet, it is an area which is often overlooked by students and teachers of mindfulness alike. Where a student is seemingly unable to develop their understanding despite repeated and sustained application to developing mindfulness, the reason is, more often than not, because they have not practiced retrospection. The vital information so painstakingly acquired in the first place is instantly lost again as the mind's ever-shifting attention moves on to the next experience. Retrospection gives us the opportunity of a second viewing, a kind of edited highlights show. It's during periods of retrospection that we catch significant events that might otherwise have been missed. Retrospection is about pattern recognition. Wisdom is more than just being aware of our subjective experience. It includes being able to clearly comprehend the order of events and seeing the links and relationships between those events. It's in this way that we come to recognize unmistakably how we create our own suffering. For instance, a meditator finally comes to understand that the ill will he directs towards a work colleague is actually an attempt to eliminate the painful feelings he experiences every time he has any contact with her. Further, he sees quite clearly that it's indulging the ill will that creates the subsequent painful feelings each time they meet. Thus, he comprehends that his suffering really is of his own making and has nothing to do with his colleague at all. In the heat of the moment, these links may not be so easy to discern, but in hindsight, when we've calmed down a little bit, such patterns can stand out much more clearly. Retrospection can in fact be developed systematically as part of one's mindfulness practice. At the House of Inner Tranquility, we teach people to break down a period of mindfulness into smaller parts, and at the end of each part to incorporate a brief retrospection. For instance, practicing walking meditation around our Japanese garden, a student might break up a walk into smaller stages, say a distance of approximately 5 meters, from the top of the path to the stone lantern, and then a similar distance from the lantern to the pond. An intention to stop and reflect at the appointed place is made, and then the student gives over completely to being mindful of the physical and mental processes of walking, and being aware of and noting any distractions that arise. Having reached the designated place, the student then stops briefly to see if he or she can remember where the mind went and what happened. Was the student mindful of the changes in motion, pressure, and temperature in the sensations of the soles of the feet? Or was the mind distracted by something? If so, can the student remember what it was and the order of events? Having briefly cast the mind back in this way, the student can then let go of any concern about whatever happened, recognizing how all those elements have now passed away and setting up a new intention for the next stage of the walk. Another important way to incorporate retrospection is to keep a meditation journal. After each meditation, an entry is made of what we can remember happening. The entries do not have to be long, neither do they have to be literary masterpieces. The object of the exercise is simply to note down what happened and in what order, to the best of one's ability. Over time, patterns of behavior begin to emerge, and insights into why things occur in the way that they do become apparent. The clear comprehension gleaned during periods of retrospection can then further support our meditation practice. For example, one student often felt a strong frustration whenever she tried hard to restrain the habitual tendency of daydreaming during the meditation. Reviewing the notes in her journal, she observed how regularly this same pattern emerged, and it suddenly dawned on her that she was making an assumption. She had taken it for granted that the frustration was a sign that her efforts to control the mind were not working. Reading her notes, she realized that it was actually a sign that she was succeeding, and the frustration was simply the mind complaining because it was not being allowed to wander as it had always previously been allowed to do. This discovery transformed the meditator's attitude, and she was able to return to her practice primed and ready to look out for the frustration when it next arose. Often, students are willing to set up mindfulness, but discover a peculiar resistance to developing the retrospection. Such reluctance may have a variety of causes. Sometimes it's just a lazy approach, whereby the student is unwilling to put in the extra effort required to make it happen. Some meditators, on the other hand, find it difficult initially to acknowledge negative aspects of their own nature, like hatred or conceit. Others may find that they are impatient for results or are mistakenly judging themselves in terms of success or failure based on what their retrospection is revealing. In any event, by not being reflective, they can maintain an ignorance is bliss attitude. This is a shame, because much of the hard work has already been done. To recognize a lack of mindfulness requires surprisingly good levels of mindfulness. Recognizing a negative mental state can easily be regarded as an entirely positive result of practicing. Whilst it can be painful to see that we have not been mindful or discover negative qualities within ourselves, these are of themselves not a problem. The problem is self-concern, often arising in the form that says, "It should not have been like that," or "I should know better." Believing these thoughts is what often leads students to avoid doing retrospection altogether. The remedy is to become mindful of the reluctance when it happens, in order to see for oneself what lies behind it. Is it just laziness, or an overwhelming desire to get some tangible results? Or is it something even more pernicious, like an inability to accept the existence of a negative mental quality like hatred? To find out, you must create a strong intention to practice the retrospection, with a view to watching the resistance arise. If you can restrain the urge to give in to it and remain alert, then it's possible to notice what it is that underlies this non-acceptance. There's another issue with regard to retrospection, and this has to do with recognizing the difference between wise reflection and speculation. Whereas wise reflection seeks to know only the facts and the order those facts arose in, speculation takes those facts and starts to spin endless webs of hypotheses, possibilities, and implications regarding them. Intellectual types take their own thinking to be the final arbiter or authority of what is right and true. They tend to draw conclusions based on a minimal amount of mindfulness but a great deal of reading, and believe that this is what it is to understand. Such speculation causes doubt in meditators' minds, and doubt is a most pernicious hindrance that can destroy all confidence in the practice. At its worst, this approach has even led some to claim to be enlightened, when, sadly, anything but this is the reality. There's a world of difference between practicing mindfulness and thinking about practicing mindfulness. I estimate that wise reflection and study combined should account for only approximately 20% of a student's overall commitment. The other 80% should be dedicated to direct, mindful experience. Insights come spontaneously as a consequence of the raw, direct investigation of subjective reality. They are never the product of thought, and the validity of ideas gleaned from study and retrospection need always to be verified through further direct observation. I remember not long after I had begun my life as a recluse, my teacher asked me how I was getting on. After a brief discussion, he said that, although it might appear that the Buddha's teaching consisted of a whole bunch of loose ends, with perseverance in the training, the drawstrings would finally all come together, and I would see how all the various strands actually formed a perfect whole. He was right, of course, and wise reflection is a fundamental part of that process, helping to connect the theory with the reality of our subjective experience. Whenever such connections are made, that is when the training enters into a whole new dimension in terms of application, enthusiasm, and understanding. Then it's as if the whole world lights up before our eyes.